We have three wonderful speakers for our second panel this morning. In the interest of leaving as much time as possible for the papers and especially for the question period to follow, I will say as little as possible by way of introduction. Our first speaker, Professor Marty, by now doesn't need any introduction. Our second speaker is Professor Phyllis Bernard from Oklahoma City University, and she's an expert on the very interesting topic of reconciliation. And our third speaker, Greg Barton from Monash University in Australia, is an expert on Islamic reform movements in Indonesia and Turkey. So welcome to our panel, and I know you're looking forward to the presentations as much as I am. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
The HIZMET movement and civic engagement is my assigned topic, and I welcome it. I couldn't get past the word engagement without reflecting on why it is chosen, why it appears so often, along with synonyms and analogs in the Gülen movement along the way. I looked it up in the Oxford English Dictionary, and engagement is a formal promise, an understanding, a covenant, but it may also be informal. And I think the uses through which Gülen has put it, I don't know the Turkish word for engagement or any of the synonyms, but the use which he's put it describes very well the nature of the relationship of this movement to others. Not in my written paper, but it came to me later when to be graphic as possible about what struck me about it, is a parable by Arthur Schopenhauer, philosopher, about porcupines who on a cold night got too close to each other and got pricked by each other's quills, and the next morning the survivors had to pick out the quills from what was left and go on, and they learned you shouldn't get too close. The next cold night they stayed too far apart and half of them froze, and therefore they had to learn the right way to be distant and near, and intimate and remote along the way. And English philosopher Michael Oakeshott said, the porcupines didn't know it, but they discovered or they invented civic association. And I think that's something of what goes on through this movement, and I'll elaborate. In the formation of the movement, based on Gülen's writings and example, as we heard in the earlier session, there's a repertoire of options. There are different ways in which people who, like he, would be orthodox in his faith, Sufi versions of Islam, and wanting to do what he's out to do, educate, stimulate international business occasions, represent religion along the way. And I think there are three options that we're seeing around us in the world today. When you have the other around, you destroy the other. Along the 10th parallel, we know that Muslims and Christians are out to destroy each other for complex reasons we can't go into here. And a lot of people in the United States find it advantageous to think that every Muslim is part of Islamism. As Franklin Graham, the evangelist, says, Islam is by nature, top to bottom, a wicked and evil religion. He demonizes it and would like to destroy it. The opposite would be convert. That is, try to make everybody like yourself. As the movement out to do that. Some people are suspecting it. Some would see it a betrayal. You certainly betray the nature of civil dialogue if you convert a dialogical session into an attempt to convert the other. The French philosopher Gabriel Marcel says that when you do that, we are very vulnerable to each other in dialogue, in exposure, in engagement. And you can't take advantage of that. And therefore, if you do, he's speaking to Christians, what you're doing is witnessing to a God of pounce and prey, a very loathsome image of God. But some people think that every such contact with the other has to result in or be clearly directed toward the conversion of the other, so you all become the same. And the third option would be merger, fusion, taking all the elements as you can and coming about to a single thing. I'll have a little bit more to say about that a little later. But I think that Gülen's humanism, richly informed by his piety, his knowledge, his concern, provides another model. My theme is the risk and the promise of doing these things. Again, you could be exclusivistic about the truths that you have, or you can just blend them all into something. I met recently with an interfaith group of young people in Chicago, 27 of them. My wife and I had breakfast with them, and I started, instead of lecturing, they all had a pad, and I said, write down when somebody's critical of you. We're talking people from Unitarianism to Wheaton College evangelicals. They're all working together on this cause. If somebody thinks if they're suspicious or they don't like it, what do they fear most about what you're doing? And I'll translate it to my word, that they'll be wishy-washy. The standard word is, after all, we're only in different boats and heading for the same shore. And you'd like to examine the boats and the leaky ones and those that work and those that have to get towed back to San Diego. There are a lot of different kinds of boats, and we should care about them along the way. The anti-Muslim Americans, and there are many of them, who seek political advantage from it or just speak out of fear or ignorance, when they hear the Gülen explicit Sufi Islam, they say, you know, aha, we caught you along the way. The doctrinaire Muslims, on the other hand, say you're bartering away everything that's important to us. I had sought for a model. It's very clear that Gülen himself has spoken of the universalizing tendencies. Quote, all of us believe in the same God. We might understand certain things differently, but why should that keep us from working together to uplift humanity and turn it toward God? Why should we let our differences divide us against the onslaught of atheism and unbelief sweeping the modern world? So that's his affirmation of likeness, and yet many people hear him go on, and you find out that he is very much a part of one of the stories, and that's what I'm going to engage in next. How do we fit the two together? He says Islam recognizes all religions previous to it. It accepts the prophets and books sent to different epochs of history. Not only does it accept them, but also regards belief in them as an essential principle of being Muslim. By doing so, it acknowledges the basic unity of all religions. A Muslim is at the same time a true follower of Abraham, Moses, David, Jesus, and all the other Hebrew prophets. This belief explains why Christians and Jews enjoyed their religious rights under the rule of Islamic governments throughout history. Not all of history and not all governments, but we have some examples. 1492, when Ferdinand and Isabella kicked the Jews out of Iberian Peninsula, many of them found their way in the Ottoman Empire, and one of them said, what kind of monarch is this that she sends us her best people? Because they were well equipped and all the rest. So there were systems by which this could all work. Oliver Lehman in a paper says there's an apparent paradox now at the heart of the Gülen approach. On the one hand, there is a determination to present a version of Islam that is rational, inclusive, progressive, and tolerant. The broad aim is to show Islam to be a universal faith, one that has no difficulties in coexisting with other religions, and indeed with those who have no religion at all. On the other hand, Islam is definitely portrayed as the superior form of belief, often because it's seen as incorporating in the best possible ways rational and spiritual virtues present in many other approaches to understanding the nature of the world. Yet how can Islam be represented as one among many, as the first among many? That's the question I think you have to ask of every Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, anybody who is involved in interfaith things. How do they relate the two? Here's my own little clue, which I took from George Santayana, an American philosopher of 100 years ago. He was brought up in Spain and Harvard, and made a blend out of that. He once was asked about his own faith. He said, I believe that there is no God and Mary is his mother. He says, any attempt to speak without speaking any particular language is not more hopeless than the attempt to have a religion that shall be no religion in particular. Thus, every living and healthy religion has a marked idiosyncrasy. Its power consists in its special and surprising message and in the bias which that revelation gives to life. The vistas it opens and the mysteries it propounds are another world to live in. And another world to live in, whether we expect ever to pass wholly over into it or not, is what we mean by having a religion. This group that I spoke of, the Interfaith Youth Corps, for example, you can't be a member of it, very popular in high schools and colleges, unless you are active in your own faith. You gather on a Saturday morning and you are asked, what does your faith have to say about the family? And you better scramble back and find out what your faith has to say about the family. Or how do you read texts or whatever? I think this is what Santayana is getting at. The religions should do what we're doing here, open face to each other. I was listening for anything in the first 3 presentations where I'd have to close the door and say they're not talking about a world that's open to me. No, we're none. We're like that. We do that along the way, and yet the energizing and the motivating and the enduring power in Gülen's case and others come from what he calls the strange and idiosyncratic stories that we tell. I don't have time here, but in my written paper I use the illustration of Abraham sacrificing his son. It's in the Hebrew Scriptures. The Christians took it over in their Bible, and it's in Quran in a different form. And it's intended to do 3 very different things. First of all, it is a strange, idiosyncratic story. Just try that out on anybody today, and they'd say, well, that's child abuse, and oh, poor Sarah, and oh, it's a strange story. And yet it's part of the redemptive story in all 3 cases. And you get stuck in line 1 because Quran, it's not Abraham and Isaac, but Abraham and Ishmael. Now, that story can be learned from by the others, but it energizes the Muslim in a different way than it energizes Abraham and Isaac for the Jew or the Christian. So what are you going to do when you have these differences along the way? And the answer that you get from Gülen is tolerance, but not only tolerance. I've chosen the word, and I distill this also in his writings, a much better and stronger word, hospitality. Those of us who visited Turkey all come home saying, I take a picture of kids, and by the time we get back on the bus, the mother's out there with a grapefruit for us. At the end of 10 days, I asked 16 people, you've had 480 meals here. Was there ever a time you weren't welcomed? Any time you were treated surlily by a wait person? Nobody had an example. Now, that is not only a habit, it is grounded in an approach to life and a set of beliefs that I think carries over, and he makes a great deal of it. Aisa Sasa, in one of his writings about Gülen, says, carried over from this generation to, he's describing how difficult his stance is, and my final remarks are going to have to deal with how it is, how the Gülen movement and every member in it, anybody else who's undertaking the kind of mission, interpretation he does, is always going to be in a kind of a precarious situation. And you read the biography of Gülen, you can see he's get buffeted by both sides and all sides, and yet doesn't lose his footing. It's a part of a culture that's been left without a horizon or a dream by a 300-year-long gradual decline, according to Gülen, and now it's picked up, and along the way, he, says an observer, has climbed and persisted in climbing a very steep mountain through the dark period of decline and now in its recovery. And here's what Asa Sasa said, in very lavish terms, but after all, it's confidence in his name, we're allowed to be lavish. Finally, carried over from one generation to the next, this legendary resistance, standing on Mount Everest, as it were, pauses to take a new look at the world. Taking into view the universe's horizon from a 360-degree progressive you can only get by going up there, it smiles. When we look at the horizon from this perspective, we share a cosmic dream, broken off from the ancient Earth's garden, a fully universal and peaceful spring dream's breadth, indescribable pleasure and translucency. And he illustrates from Gülen's own career in dealing with opposition that he uses that kind of perspective. But as I read that, I thought of one of my favorite illustrative poems that describes my intention to help locate Gülen and the movement, in the world we have today, with the religions at war with each other, minorities in each religion working very strongly to find concord, and probably the mass of the people in all of them preferring not to have the conflict into which they're often thrown. And here comes someone like Gülen, who is on that Everest where he gets a 360-degree perspective. That means he can always see who the enemies are. On the one hand, secularistic-like people in doctrinaire and ideological politics are thoroughly convinced that he is out to subvert them by replacing it with a jihadist regime, and the militants in other nations, and the few that are in Turkey by comparison, again, as I said earlier, think he's giving the game away. And there's never a page in his writings where he can say, now finally we're on that great plain where there's nothing there. It's the human condition. It's simply if you live as intensely as he does and thinks as intensely as he does, he's alert to it from that perspective. So my illustration for this is an image in W.H. Auden's poem called September 1940. The war has begun, and he's looking out at all the forces out there, and the people who are trying to find a way through it, humanizers and so on. He takes the image of the arete, A-R-E-T with the little caret on top. I write sometimes, and people say, I looked it up in the dictionary, and it's arete, the Greek word. No, it's the French word for that very tip top of the mountain, the sharp edge, or the very sharp edge of the cliff. And Auden pictures someone, now picture Gülen and the movement there, with the forces I've described all around him. Here it goes. Perched upon the sharp arete, where if we do not move, we fall. Yet movement is heretical, since over its ironic rocks, no move is truly orthodox. You have to move, you have to keep balance, you're highly alert of doing that along the way. And I think it's so interesting that the Gülen movement has spent so much energy not in politics, which is only one form of civic engagement, but in voluntary activities, in education, in philanthropy, in business, in charitable work, and so on. Because there too, you are not exempt from all these forces that are pressing upon you. So picture that image as you read him, if you will. You don't have to read him the way I do, but it seems to me that's where he's poised and postured and makes reading him exciting, tantalizing, and in terms of my title, full of risk and of promise. Finally, civic engagement needs models. We all have them. We have them in our local communities. Somebody on a school board or the school custodian, somebody or other who could hold these things together in the simplest of life, or highly educated people, people who are on the front lines in religious, philosophical, economic life, and so on. We need models, and in this field, I would argue that what Gülen has achieved beyond his own movement and scope is to serve as a kind of a model. The Latin word in the Middle Ages for this was the exemplum. I've read a whole book about the exemplum, which elaborates on what does the exemplum do. Exemplum, you can see it's cut out, like excise. What is cut out in a medieval dictionary, and the illustration was cut out like a clearing in the woods. And you pick out from there, what does a clearing in the woods do? These three things, and that's what I get from Gülen and the movement. One, it defines. You're in the dark wood that Dante talks about, brambles, animals. You have no idea what's there, and all of a sudden you come to a clearing. Woods end, clearing starts. Very helpful. And I think that these attempts he makes are to give us that sense of clarity of definition. To take one illustration, the very concept of interfaith. It is very hard to find any illustrations of that, certainly before the Western Enlightenment, and it didn't do it very well. A lot of us dated to the 1893 World Parliament of Religion. People began to talk in those terms, but it's really only the last several decades in which you can picture that it's a linguistic coin of the realm anywhere you go. People now know there's such a thing as interfaith, but you need models for it. And some of them failed along the way, and I think that he is, in this sense, a definer. Secondly, what does the clearing in the woods do? It's the place where light falls and is allowed to fall. You've been lost in the dark, and the clearing, whether it's under moonlight or sunlight, is the clarifying place. And I think that light is something that he aspires to keep bringing. And finally, it's where cultivation goes on. And that's the main part of what the movement has to do along the way. If I can be parochial and provincial and Illinoisan for a little while, or Kentuckian, my best illustration of cultivation in a clearing is our great President Abraham Lincoln. Picture February 12th, 1809, a clearing in the woods. You can all imagine it You can live anywhere in the world. You've probably seen examples. There's a little cabin, and a little smoke coming out of the chimney. There's a cow tethered on the side. There's a little corn, and Thomas Lincoln is tossing a basin of water out there. In the movies, always whenever there's a birth without doctors around, they have a basin of hot water. He's doing that, and I'll picture if he'd come out to you and said, "The author of the Emancipation Proclamation has just been born." It was true, but it took a lot of cultivating by his access to books and to other people, his life in politics, his humane spirit, and I think that's what we look for in the movement along the way. It's never a finished product. It's always perched precariously, but it's also a part of a light-bringing, defining, and cultivating effort. Thank you.